AITA for refusing to let my brother's family stay with me after they lost their home. I bought my house 5 years ago when I was 29. It's nothing extravagant, just a modest 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in a quiet neighborhood. It's the perfect size for me, considering I live alone. One of the bedrooms serves as my home office since I work from home full-time, and the other is a guest room that doubles as a hobby space where I keep my music equipment and gaming setup. It's my sanctuary. My space. My home. And I love it. My brother, on the other hand, has always lived a very different lifestyle. He's 4 years older than me and married with 3 kids, 2 daughters and a son, ages 12, 10, and 7. He and his wife made good money for a while, but they never lived within their means. Even when times were tough, they refused to adjust. It was as if they were allergic to financial responsibility. My brother had a well-paying job until about 2 years ago, but he kept showing up late, making excuses, and, ultimately, got himself fired. Instead of tightening their budget and making practical changes, they continued spending as if nothing had changed. His wife worked part-time, but they still kept their kids in expensive private schools, paid for extracurricular activities, and held on to their large house despite clearly struggling to keep up with mortgage payments. Over time, it all caught up to them. Their savings dried up. The bills piled up. The bank came knocking. And, finally, they lost their home to foreclosure. When it all came crashing down, they reached out to me. My brother called and said they needed a place to stay for just a few months while they got back on their feet. He framed it as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. But for me, it wasn't that simple. Letting them move in would mean giving up my entire house. There were 5 of them. 5. My 3-bedroom house wasn't designed for 6 people. They would take over the entire living space. My home office, where I work every day, would likely have to be sacrificed. I imagine trying to focus on meetings and deadlines with 3 kids running around, screaming, arguing, and playing. It would be absolute chaos. Not to mention, I deeply value my peace and solitude. My home is my retreat. The idea of having a full house 24/7, with no real personal space or quiet, was suffocating. And beyond all that, I didn't believe it would just be for a few months. Based on their track record, I had no reason to think they would get their finances together quickly. I knew that once they were in, it would be nearly impossible to get them to leave. A few months could easily turn into a year, or more. And if I ever tried to ask them to move out, I would be the villain. But here's the thing, I didn't just say no and leave them to fend for themselves. I genuinely wanted to help, just not at the cost of my own home and peace of mind. I offered to pay for a hotel for 2 weeks while they searched for an apartment. I also offered to cover their security deposit to help them move into something more affordable. It wasn't as if I was throwing them out onto the street. I was offering a very real, very generous solution that would allow them to have their own space while they figured things out. My brother didn't see it that way. He blew up at me. He accused me of being selfish, of choosing things over family. He said that I had plenty of room and that I was just making excuses. His wife wasn't any better. She sent me a long, guilt-trippy text about how she thought family was supposed to help each other in times of need and how she couldn't believe I would turn my back on them. And then, the cherry on top, they refused my offer for a hotel or an apartment and instead moved in with my parents. This was particularly frustrating because my parents had offered to let them stay with them from the very beginning. But my brother and his wife initially refused, saying they didn't want to live by my parents' rules. Apparently, their pride was more important than having a stable place to stay. But when I said no, suddenly my parents' house was good enough. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. My brother and his wife didn't just move in with my parents, they made it a whole drama. My brother vented to extended family, and soon enough, I was being bombarded with messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all shaming me for abandoning my family in their time of need. My brother's wife even started posting passive-aggressive things on social media about how hard times reveal who your real family is and how some people would rather keep their empty rooms than help the ones who need it. It was exhausting. I knew I had made the right decision for myself, but the guilt-tripping from everyone around me made me second-guess for a brief moment. But then I reminded myself, this wasn't my fault. I wasn't the one who had mismanaged my finances and ignored every warning sign. I wasn't the one who had refused to downsize when it was the obvious, responsible thing to do. And I wasn't the one refusing help just because it didn't come in the exact form I wanted. I didn't owe them my home just because they made bad choices. I was still willing to help, but on my terms. If that wasn't good enough for them, that was on them, not me. So, am I the asshole for refusing to let them move in? Because right now, it sure feels like half my family thinks I am. Update 1. So, after all the drama, I did my best to ignore the guilt-tripping and just move on with my life. My parents had taken them in, which meant they weren't homeless, and as far as I was concerned, that was the end of it. They had a roof over their heads, my peace and quiet remained intact, and I wasn't shouldering the responsibility of housing an entire family of 5. It wasn't ideal, but it was a resolution I could live with. For the first few weeks, things were quiet on my end. I still got the occasional passive-aggressive text from my brother or his wife, but I just ignored them. The social media posts about finding out who your real family is kept coming, but I stopped caring. If they wanted to play the victims to our extended family, fine. I had done my part. I had offered to help on my terms, and they had refused. That was their problem, not mine. But then, about 2 months later, I got a call from my mom. The second I answered, I could hear the barely contained fury in her voice. My mom is a patient woman, but when she reaches her breaking point, she really reaches it. And that night, she had reached it. Apparently, my brother and his wife had been lying to all of us. They weren't as broke as they claimed. My mom had overheard a conversation between them late at night, one of those whispered, hushed discussions they didn't want anyone else to hear. Normally, she wouldn't eavesdrop, but something about their tone caught her attention, and she listened. That's when she found out the truth. They had money. Not just a little emergency cash, but a decent chunk sitting in a secret bank account. They had been hoarding funds while living rent-free at my parents' house, all while making me, and everyone else, feel guilty for not giving them a place to stay. They weren't struggling to find an apartment because they couldn't afford one. They weren't desperately scraping by, paycheck to paycheck. No, they were choosing to stay with my parents as long as possible so they could rebuild their savings before moving out. They had an entire strategy worked out, dragging their feet, playing up the hardship, knowing my parents wouldn't kick them out immediately. They had enough to afford rent. They had enough to start over. But instead, they let my parents feed them, cover their utilities, and put up with the chaos of 3 kids in the house, all while they sat on their money and milked the situation for all it was worth. My mom was furious. The next morning, she confronted them outright, demanding to know how long they had been lying. And instead of owning up to it, my brother doubled down. He tried to gaslight her, saying she was being paranoid, misinterpreting things, blowing it out of proportion. But my mom had heard everything. She knew exactly what she had overheard, and there was no talking his way out of it. My dad, who had been patient up to this point, was done, too. They told my brother and his wife that they had 1 month, 30 days, to find their own place and leave. Suddenly, my brother wasn't so proud anymore. He and his wife didn't have the same smug, self-righteous energy they had when they were guilting me for not taking them in. Now that they were the ones being told to leave, it was different. My mom said there was a lot of stammering, a lot of excuses, but she didn't budge. She told them they had more than enough time to get their act together, that they had chosen to mooch instead of taking responsibility, and that she was done enabling them. Reality must have hit them fast because, within a week, they were already scrambling to find an apartment. No more complaints about rent being too high. No more whining about how impossible it was to find something affordable. Funny how, when they actually had a deadline, things moved quickly. Within weeks, they were gone. And the best part? Once they moved out, the social media posts about hard times revealing real family stopped immediately. Almost like the whole thing was an act. Update 2. Just when I thought things had finally settled down, life decided to throw another curveball. A few months after my brother and his family had moved out of my parents' house, I was starting to believe that the drama was finally behind me. I had stopped hearing about them through the grapevine, the passive-aggressive social media posts had dwindled, and I had more or less put the whole ordeal out of my mind. My house remained peaceful, my routine uninterrupted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't constantly bracing for another guilt trip or family intervention. It was nice. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from an unknown number. It was short and to the point. "Hey, it's Mark. We need to talk. It's urgent." I stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether to respond at all. I knew exactly how these things went. Nothing my brother ever called urgent was actually urgent. It was just a ploy to get my attention, a hook to drag me back into whatever mess he had gotten himself into this time. I almost deleted the message without responding. After everything that had happened, I had no interest in reopening that chapter of my life. I had done my part, endured the name-calling, the social exile from certain relatives, the endless emotional manipulation, and I had finally come out the other side. What could possibly be so urgent now? But then curiosity got the better of me. Part of me wondered if it really was an emergency. Something about the wording, the lack of pleasantries or preamble, made me pause. What if something had happened to one of the kids? What if it really was serious this time? Against my better judgment, I called him back. The second he answered, I knew exactly why he had reached out. His voice, which had been filled with righteous indignation the last time we spoke, was now dripping with desperation. My brother, the same one who had spent months calling me selfish, cold-hearted, and greedy, was now practically begging me for a loan. He wasted no time getting to the point, launching into a frantic explanation about how they had finally managed to rent a house, but the landlord was threatening eviction because they were already behind on rent. Again. I listened in silence as he spun his usual tale of misfortune, every word carefully chosen to make it sound like life had just happened to him, as if none of this was the result of his own choices. I asked him point-blank what had happened to all that rebuilding their savings nonsense, and his tone immediately shifted. He got defensive, muttering something about unexpected expenses and bad luck, like he hadn't personally ensured their financial downfall twice in less than a year. It was the same vague, excuse-laden nonsense I had heard time and time again. Then came the real bombshell. Since moving out, instead of learning from their mistakes and tightening their belts, they had somehow managed to dig themselves even deeper into debt. They had splurged on brand new furniture for the rental, put the kids into even more expensive extracurricular activities, and, this one nearly made me drop the phone, had taken a trip to Disneyland. Disneyland. While they were struggling to make rent. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat, not out of amusement, but in sheer disbelief. It was as if I was listening to a parody of my own life, as if someone had taken all the worst traits of my brother and dialed them up to cartoonish levels. He had watched his own family go through foreclosure. He had felt the humiliation of losing his home, of uprooting his kids, of having to beg for a place to stay. He had spent months mooching off our parents under false pretenses, lying about his financial situation just to squeeze out a few more months of free living. And now, given a second chance, he had gone and done the exact same thing all over again. It was baffling. How did someone make it through all of that and come out without learning a single lesson? And yet, there he was, swearing up and down that this time was different. He said he had learned his lesson, that he was finally seeing how hard life could be, that he just needed a little help to get back on his feet. Just enough to keep the lights on, just until the next paycheck, just a little support from his loving brother. I had heard every single one of those words before. I had heard them the first time he called me, back when I was still willing to believe that he genuinely wanted to change. I had heard them from my parents, who had given him every possible opportunity to do better, only to be met with disappointment after disappointment. It was the same script, the same cycle, playing out again and again. But this time, I knew better. I told him no. The shift was immediate. The pleading evaporated, replaced with unfiltered anger. The voice that had been soft, almost broken, just seconds before suddenly hardened. He called me a heartless bastard, accused me of turning my back on my own family, spat out something about how one day I would be the one in trouble, and how I'd regret being so selfish when that day came. And then he hung up. Just like that. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. I felt no guilt, no second-guessing, just an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. It was never going to end with him. There was no rock bottom for someone like my brother, no wake-up call, no moment of realization. He would always find a way to shift the blame, to reframe himself as the victim, to convince himself that the world was against him instead of accepting that he was the common denominator in his own failures. I thought that was the end of it. That he would move on to his next target, another relative willing to be manipulated, another friend he could guilt into lending him money. But a week later, my mom called with an update. They had moved back into my parents' house. Again. Update 3. A year later, and things have finally come full circle in a way I never expected. My brother never got his act together. Despite every opportunity handed to him, despite every warning sign, he continued on the same path, making the same mistakes, telling the same lies. There was no lesson learned, no grand realization, no redemption arc. He bounced from job to job, never holding anything down for more than a few months. At first, he would start off enthusiastic, making big promises about how this job would be different, how he was finally getting his life together, how this was his fresh start. Then, inevitably, something would go wrong. He would start showing up late, calling in sick for reasons that didn't make sense, complaining about his bosses or coworkers, looking for any excuse to justify why he couldn't stay. Every new opportunity ended the same way. He either got fired for being unreliable, or he quit, claiming it was a toxic work environment, or that he was meant for something better. It was never his fault. It was never about his own choices. There was always someone else to blame, always some external reason why he just couldn't catch a break. His wife took up part-time work, but it was never enough to keep them afloat. She had long since adopted his mindset, believing that life was just unfair to them, that no matter what they did, they were doomed to struggle. But what they were really doomed by was their refusal to take responsibility. Without the cushion of free housing, their financial struggles caught up with them fast. The reality of paying rent, utilities, groceries, and everyday expenses, things that other adults managed just fine, was crushing for them because they had never learned how to live within their means. They still tried to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford, spending money on things that weren't necessities while bills piled up around them. My parents, to their credit, actually stuck to their deadline. At the 6-month mark, they told my brother and his wife that they needed to leave. There were no extensions, no negotiations, no excuses accepted. They had been given more than enough time to figure things out, and my parents weren't about to spend the rest of their retirement taking care of 2 grown adults who refused to take care of themselves. For the first time, my brother's usual tactics didn't work. He tried to play the victim, telling them how hard it was to find stable work, how expensive everything had become, how they just needed a little more time. When that didn't work, he got angry, accusing them of turning their backs on their own family, of being just as selfish as I was. And when even that didn't change their minds, he resorted to desperation, pleading with them, making empty promises that this time, things would be different. But my parents didn't budge. They had seen it all before. They had already given him so much more than he deserved, and he had done nothing but waste every opportunity. For the first time in his life, he had to face actual consequences. And so, with nowhere else to turn, they scraped together just enough money to rent a small apartment, a far cry from the house they had lost, a massive downgrade from the lifestyle they had insisted on maintaining for years. But even with lower rent and fewer expenses, they still couldn't manage their finances. The same reckless spending continued. The same unwillingness to budget, to plan, to take responsibility. Within months, they were back in crisis mode, struggling to pay bills, dodging debt collectors, complaining to anyone who would listen about how unfair life was. They still refused to acknowledge that they were the problem. My brother would rant about how impossible it was to get ahead, how the economy was stacked against them, how landlords were greedy, how jobs never paid enough. But somehow, despite all these so-called impossible obstacles, plenty of people in far worse situations managed to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. But he wasn't interested in seeing that. He wasn't interested in facing the reality that his problems were entirely self-inflicted. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from an old friend of mine who works in finance. It was unexpected, he and I hadn't spoken in a while, and his message was casual, almost curious. He asked, "Hey, isn't Mark your brother? Because I just saw something crazy." I felt a familiar dread creep up my spine. My brother's name being brought up in any conversation usually meant bad news. I braced myself for whatever it was, assuming it was another complaint about borrowed money never repaid, or maybe a new financial disaster he had caused. But what my friend told me was far worse than anything I had imagined. Apparently, my brother had been lying about how broke he was. For years. He had been funneling money into a hidden account, money that could have saved them from foreclosure the first time, money that could have kept them from needing help from my parents, from begging me for loans, from playing the victim to anyone who would listen. But instead of using it when they were in crisis, instead of saving his family from homelessness and humiliation, he hoarded it. Let his kids believe they were on the verge of being out on the street. Let his wife cry about how cruel the world was. Let my parents and I lose sleep worrying about how to help him. All while secretly keeping a financial safety net for himself. It was such a ridiculous level of deception that I almost couldn't process it at first. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The way he had always acted like he was just barely getting by, yet somehow never made any actual lifestyle changes. The way he always had an excuse, a reason why he couldn't get back on his feet, despite being given every opportunity to do so. The way he had always seemed too comfortable leeching off others, like he knew deep down he wasn't really at risk of losing everything. I confronted my mom about it, and she went silent for a long time before finally admitting that my dad had also heard rumors about my brother's hidden stash but had never been able to prove it. My dad had always suspected that my brother's broke act wasn't entirely true, but without solid evidence, there wasn't much he could do. Now, with my friend's information, the truth was out. My brother had scammed his way into free housing, free food, and endless sympathy, all while secretly keeping enough money to save himself at any time. He had let his family suffer, had let his kids live through financial instability, all so he could sit on a pile of money he refused to touch. The fallout was immediate. The debt collectors he had been dodging for years also found out about the hidden money. And suddenly, everything came crashing down. He wasn't just drowning in overdue payments anymore, he now owed way more than he had stashed away. The bank accounts he thought were hidden weren't so hidden anymore. The debts he had run from had finally caught up to him. And now, he was facing serious legal trouble. For the first time in his life, there was no one left to bail him out. No free housing, no sympathetic family members willing to cover his mistakes, no convenient scapegoats to blame. He had run out of people to lie to, out of excuses to make, out of second chances. As for me, I felt nothing but relief. For so long, I had wondered if I had been wrong for not letting them move in. If I had been too harsh, too cold, too unwilling to help. I had spent months fielding accusations, dealing with judgmental relatives, listening to passive-aggressive comments about how family should stick together. I had replayed my decision over and over again, questioning if I had made the right call. But now, I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had done the right thing. My brother had never needed my help. He had needed an enabler. And I refused to be one.